Good evening, friends. Thank you all for coming. I'm told that this is being streamed, whatever that means. I'm from a generation that doesn't know what streaming is, but reminder to please turn off your phones. And with that, let me proceed. Since all of our speakers are now here. And thank you all for coming. You too. Allow me, if you will, to be intentionally provocative. How quickly things change. In 1989, a prominent thinker in the United States decreed the end of history. Just a few years later, that thinker was at war, Francis Fukuyama, was at war with the Bush administration over Iraq policy. And you all know how that has continued. In May of last year, another neocon conservative thinker in the US, Robert Kaplan, wrote, quote, "World order shows signs of cracking," close quote. Now, I would say that Kaplan, a strong supporter of the Iraq war, was a big contributor to those cracks, but that's another story. We're not here to talk about that. A glance at today's headlines would seem to support the crack's conclusion. Ukraine and Syria, Libya, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. Speaking for myself, I see three destructive trends in world affairs. One, the last 2 decades has witnessed, first, the rise of Al-Qaeda and its offspring, then more recently of ISIL and Daesh across the Islamic world, then of Boko Haram in Africa, sub-Saharan pirates across the Indian Ocean, and finally, and for a long time in Colombia, the FARC. The common strain of all such groups is they seem to see nation states as the problem and not the solution. Second, some of the major powers who were at the root of post-World War II order appear to be backing off somewhat. Go back 50, 60 years as France and the UK gave up their colonial possessions to be replaced by the United States. Now you see people saying that the United States itself is withdrawing. Open question. Was the popular reaction to, was Obama's pulling back, or a perceived pulling back, a reaction to perceived imperial overreach? I don't know. And then his reluctance to commit troops to places like Syria or Ukraine. Is that similarly withdrawing? A third, other major powers behave as if no rules restrain them. China's Asian neighbors fear a territorial encroaching Beijing. But more stark is the behavior of President Putin in Ukraine. Last Wednesday's ceasefire agreement may have had some impact on fighting in Ukraine for now, but the idea that a government would be tempted to reach beyond its borders to protect ethnic brethren brings up memories of the Balkans in the 1980s or Central Europe in the 1930s, and we all know how those ended. All this led me to ask myself, who is or what rules are governing anymore? The new U.S. national security strategy talks about a rules-based international order, but ask the majority of people in the world if they agree, I don't think you'd get a positive answer. I've heard a lot of commentators talking about the impotence of the UN Security Council in Syria, a lot more than have been talking about the UN's efficiency in resolving disputes. There's been much more criticism than praise of the WHO's handling of the Ebola crisis in the past couple of years. And hardly a week goes by without another harrowing report of a boatload of refugees stranded, seemingly stateless, in the middle of the Mediterranean, or a truckload of migrants in danger of death trying to cross the southern US border. And yet even the most well-intentioned NGOs like Médecins Sans Frontières, or extraordinarily wealthy private groups like the foundations of Bill Clinton or of Bill and Melinda Gates, would have difficulty meeting the costs and logistical challenges of the Millennium Goals of 2015 and the new targets that will follow them. I'm led to ask myself the question, where is Westphalia when we need it? Or do we need it? Is it time to move past nation states? With that, I open it up to the floor because I wouldn't attempt to answer that question, not in front of such a interested audience as you all, and not in front of such a scholarly group as is on the stage along with me. So with that, I would like to introduce the first speaker. And what I'll do is I'll introduce them with a word or two, and then we'll go from there, okay? We're going to start with Jussi Hanhimaki, professor here at GCSP. Jussi, your brilliant biography of Henry Kissinger focuses on the US role as a guarantor of world order, and Kissinger's own recent work called World Order addresses obviously the same issue. How critical is it that the US be omnipresent on the world stage? Was Obama's Syria policy of stepping back from the red line, if that's what it was doing, was it a mistake? Jussi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. A very kind introduction with one small foible that some of my colleagues know is I'm not a professor at GCSP. Even if I wanted to, they probably wouldn't hire me there, so that's okay, that's okay. Just to put the record straight. Thank you very much for the introduction and setting out some of the issues, central issues that we'll undoubtedly be talking about for the next hour and a half. And I also don't want to take up too much time because there are many, as you realize, we have a large panel today, and we do want to also get your input and questions as we move along. So let me try to answer very quickly some of the questions that you posed, Michael. And I think the key point here really is the role. Obviously, you want me to say something brilliant about the role of the United States. I can't speak for the United States, so I can speak about the United States, however, having studied it a little bit over the past much too long. And one of the issues I think everybody asks and has been asking, certainly since the 1990s, since the end of the Cold War, is whether the United States, as a former president and a former Secretary of State put it, is an indispensable nation. And I would say no, but the United States is an unavoidable nation when it comes down to international affairs. And that is a result of a few very simple facts of power. The United States remains the world's most powerful nation state. I don't think there's any question about that. The talk about American decline, which was all the rage until about a year ago or so, was well put in many ways, but missed the fact that the United States had in fact been in relative decline ever since the end of World War II, when it was artificially at such a high point in terms of its economic, military, and so-called soft power as well. The United States remains the world's largest military machine, maintains the world's largest military machine, the world's largest economy. China is getting close, as we know. And the United States, I think, carries the sort of interconnected power, networked power, that no other nation can possibly dream of, in a sense that the United States clearly is the world's most networked nation. It is the key member of a number of military alliances from NATO onwards. It is a key member in most international organizations, the major stockholder in some, like the World Bank. It is, of course, one of the two world's major nuclear weapons powers, etc., etc. There's no question the United States remains an indispensable, not indispensable necessarily, but an unavoidable power. There's also, I think, the second point about the United States, that there's a sense in the world, rightly or wrongly, that if something is to be done, the United States must be involved. I say rightly or wrongly because the record of when the United States is involved is not always particularly brilliant. I think one of the myths that I like to point out to my students every now and then is that there is this idea that if you're ever to have peace in the Middle East, the United States must somehow be the key negotiator of that particular peace. Now, I don't know how much you've been watching the news over the last 40 years, but since the man who Michael mentioned earlier, Henry Kissinger, shuttled around after the 1973 war, and then what followed up from that, which was the Camp David process in the 1970s, there hasn't been all that much progress, despite a number of American wannabe Nobel Peace Prize winners going back and forth in the Middle East trying to negotiate a peace. In fact, the opposite in many ways, of course, is probably true. So we can, whatever, that is just one example I like to point out to my students, provoke, as Michael wanted to provoke us, to perhaps get some discussion and some of my colleagues to perhaps go down this road. Now, the second point you asked, was the Syrian policy a mistake? And the simple answer, the easy answer is we'll never know. We simply will never know, because we wouldn't have known what would have been the consequences of American military engagement in Syria in 2011. Would it have fueled the ISIS? Because there would have been so many more American targets around, and of course Americans are, if anything, good targets for those who wish to indeed promote their cause, such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other terrorist organizations. It is a good way to get press, so to speak, to get attention to the cause, and inevitably to recruit from that large reservoir of disaffected young men mainly that inhabit the Middle East in the millions, which is of course where ISIS and other groups gather their support. Was Syrian policy a mistake? No, I don't know if it was a mistake or not. That's not really the point. I think what the decision about Syria, however, tells us something is about the American system, American political system. It tells us that indeed, be it the world's most important nation state or not, it is also stuck in its particular type of democracy, in which foreign policy and domestic policy simply cannot be, never will be, divorced from the other. And I think in that sense, the last point you mentioned about Westphalia, there will not be Westphalia in the 21st century. These dreams, and of course Henry Kissinger, as you mentioned, has sort of nostalgic visions about the 17th century. There are plenty of problems in the 17th century, so I wouldn't go back there to look for any kind of model for anything. But I think in broader terms, the idea that that the United States could, and since I am addressing the United States role, the United States could somehow become a power, a nation state, that could simply run a foreign policy based on something they called the national interest, or the global interest, or in pursuit of world order, and divorce that from its somewhat dysfunctional domestic politics, is a pipe dream that I don't think we will ever see occur. And I think the Syria decision in many ways was related to that. The decision not to cross the line was in many ways related to the fact that elections were not so far away. Which also means that in 2014, when of course then the decision was to indeed put some American troops and start bombing in Iraq and so on and so forth, and start waging a type of war against ISIS, could be seen as another close relationship between American domestic and foreign policy. President Obama certainly didn't have to anymore think about, as he wisely put it, he has no more elections to contest. He won them all already, so there's no more to run. So I think that's where we are in a sense. I think my short answer to your main question, which is the role of the United States, is the United States is not going away. That the United States is continuing to play an important role, whether it's in a military, in the military arena, such as in the ongoing struggle against ISIS, whether it is in negotiations related to the Ukraine, and I'm sure we'll come back to the idea about the new Cold War at some point. But at the same time, the United States remains a nation state that is not particularly well equipped to building a global order because of its dysfunctional domestic political system. I'll leave you with that thought. I'm sure we'll get the chance to come back to many of these issues.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jussi. I like starting with a provocative speaker, and you certainly fulfilled that role, so thank you very much. I'll go straight on with Frederic Koller, esteemed journalist of Le Temps, and one of my favorite writers. I love getting my Saturday edition of Le Temps to be able to read Frederic. I thank you for your profound understanding of so many international issues. One thing that Frederic seems to know better than most, certainly better than I, is China. And in China, about which you've written extensively, we see the country assuming increasingly a leadership role in world affairs. And yet Chinese leaders often like to plead poverty. I'm just a developing country. Is that starting to change? And as we look for a new world order, can we look to China to play a responsible leadership role on the world stage? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for inviting me. I guess I'm the representative of the civil society tonight as a journalist. I used to be based in China for a few years, and I still have a huge interest in what is happening there. And we often have talks with Michael on the future of China with this question, when China will lead the world and become the number one maybe in the 21st century. Well, let's start with a short answer. Today, China is the number two. That is clearly the number two. That is the short answer so far. But this number two clearly has questioned the world order under what it sees as mere US-dominated world order. That doesn't mean necessarily that it will contest the framework of the UN. That's one of the other questions that you often ask me. First point I would like to focus on is in China, clearly people or the leaders at least thinks China is in a new era. This is the new era of strategic opportunities. Something has changed and the world has to understand it's different now. You have to count on a new power. And you have to understand the trends now for the last 30 years that Deng Xiaoping launched this 改革开放, this policy of open and reforms. And after almost 40 years, we have now a completely different country. This is some kind of evidence, but it means a lot, and maybe here in Europe, we sometimes don't realize exactly what it means. Today, China is strong as an economic power, but this is new. It is strong as well as a political power. There is a new leadership, there is a new Secretary General, Mr. Xi Jinping, who is changing radically the way politics is done now in China. Well, we still have the same political party at the head, as the head of the country, but we used to have a collective direction in China, and now we have a strong man coming, getting most of the power in China. It means he's in the capacity to change the country profoundly. It meaning that he wants to launch new reforms, and you can see now for almost 2 years this campaign against corruption, which is actually a campaign for political power. This is domestically how to understand what is happening in China. And the third point, the first fact is that China now is as well a military strong power as well. It has already changed domestically a lot, and now the new era, I mean, is that China wants to change its diplomacy as well. For the last 30 years, we lived under the Deng Xiaoping's mantra that's called in China Tao Gong Yang Hui, which means stay behind the scene until we are strong enough, and then we will lead as we want to lead. We start to enter in this new era. For China now, it thinks it is in the capacity to lead somehow and to be put on equal foot with the United States. And this is something that's changed a lot in the mentality of if you have possibility of the occasion to deal with Chinese diplomats. You have seen that already for a few years. Now it becomes clear because it is in the way the leaders in China themselves speak about diplomacy. It becomes much more obvious what they expect and how they want to change the rules. That doesn't mean that we must be afraid. It's not that China wants to control everything or want to be just the sole superpower. But we have to understand that China now wants to play a new role. What does that change, actually, and what vision China has for the world order? The first step, clearly, is that China wants to be the leader in its own region, meaning Asia. Now they have this new strategy. It has been discussed last November in Beijing. Inside the Politburo, they have this workshop. That was the first time on foreign affairs for the last 6 or 8 years. And they came up with this new strategy. Now we focused, when I say we, this is the Chinese government, mainly on Asia. Before it was, the idea was to have a stable China, to have a stable relationships with the main powers in the world, especially the United States for the economic development. Stability, development, economy was the priority. So, number one relationship was with the United States, then European countries, Japan, to get the direct investment for the economy and then to the transfer of technology. Now China is strong enough, economically speaking, to have more balanced relationships with other countries. They start to develop much more close ties with the other developing countries. And you know about the BRICS with Brazil, South Africa, India, Russia, of course. And this is the first, my second point, that now China will focus on Asia first, the periphery, its neighbors, to be the leaders of this area. And we could speak of sphere of influence. Maybe we'll go back to Russia and this idea of a world order now that is organized around different spheres of influence. And China clearly has the idea to control or to be the leader in its area in terms of economy, infrastructures, and then as well in political terms. And then beyond this region, China is willing to be a more active player in the international system, and we can say clearly that China still play to the role of the United Nations. No question to change the framework or the architectures of the United Nations. They are satisfied with it, but they want to play a stronger role, to wait more on these architectures, so that they can move a bit more in the direction they want to, and to bring more of their own values, of their own ethics in the new world order. Maybe we could come back later on what kind of vision of they have as a political and moral vision, and because we have some kind of clash, not clash of civilization now in the making. I don't like this idea of clash of civilization, but we have clearly a clash of ideas, a clash of values, of political values in the making. So today it means that China, the Chinese leadership call it itself, they want this new type of great power relationship. They start to use this idea with Russia, and then they use it with United States 2 years ago when Xi Jinping went first time in the United States. That means something has changed, something has to be renewed, and basically it means that we want to be considered as an equal power to the United States. So it means China is still now in a phase that, in a prospect for more global cooperation with the United States. We've seen that, for instance, last November in Beijing, there was this APEC summit, and that was a kind of surprise because everybody expected that would be a big show between Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping, showing that they are strong together and they have a very good relationship. And at the end, what we have seen is that actually we still have very good cooperation between China and United States, so that we we've seen that there were a lot of different agreements, economic agreements, and this climate deal that was done last November in Beijing. This is very important. I think China will play a much stronger role in this area, and we'll see in the next summit in Paris. I think China will come with something just to show that they assume this new role and as a leader in the international framework. But clearly, so far, China is still acting as a number two. And I just found this quote recently of the Vice Premier Wang Yang, who said, so far, I quote, "So far China has neither the ability nor the intent to overturn US-led, rule-based world order." So they still have a kind of it's not low profile anymore as it used to be, but they're still very conscious of what is their position, and it's clearly the number 2 position. Maybe I don't know if it's. I have 1 minute to conclude because the question then of Michael will be if they are the number 2 now, it means they want to become the number 1, and of course everybody is thinking about what is the next superpower, if not China. They are the number 2 economically speaking, on the military speaking. And I don't have the answer, of course. But let me quote another eminent person, maybe. This is Lee Kuan Yew, the former Singapore Prime Minister. He's the founder of modern Singapore, and he's highly respected in China and in the United States as one of the most the successful and with the great experience of Chinese world, and he used to work closely with Deng Xiaoping as well when he launched the reforms in China. And he published a book 2 or 3 years ago, or it was a book of interviews with 2 American scholars, I guess, and he said basically this: China wants to become number 1 in Asia. This is for sure. And it will easily become the number 1 in Asia. And then at the end of this century, maybe beginning of the 22nd century, he'd like to become the number 1. And he will do everything to become the number 1. The question is, during this way to become the number 1, will it become the next Germany of Japan that we had in the 20th century, meaning that you have this clash leading to a world war? He has no answer to this. But my point is not exactly this. Is China in the capacity of becoming number 1? And this is interesting, the answer he gave. He said, actually not. Because to become the number 2, you have to lead not only with the economy and the military force, strength, but as well as cultural power. And it's for this power, which we may call the soft power, you need a language. And the Chinese main problem is Chinese language. That was his point. And when I first read that, I thought, well, it's a little bit simple as the way to look around the question. But actually, maybe he's right. Chinese language is complicated, as Chinese themselves always used to say. And it's true, it's complicated. And maybe it's the main barrier to China to become the number 1. And linked with Chinese, then you have this Chinese culture that is not, it's not prone for free debate and exchange of ideas. And this is an interesting idea, I think, that in the mouth of Lee Kuan Yew, especially, I think it's we have to think about this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Frederic. I've asked the people who control the mics not to cut people off after 10 minutes, especially when they have so many interesting things to say, but they do have the power to do so, just as a reminder. Mahmoud, I was wondering if you could join us. I've heard you speak and write, I've read what you've written about the emergence of ISIS, and I sometimes look at the emergence of ISIS as arguably the most unsettling development since the end of the Cold War. Certainly challenges the world order. How do you see that situation evolving?
Thank you, Michael. Good evening, everybody. I've been warned about my 5-10 minutes, so I'll try to keep to this. It seems to me that with such a simple, yet of course loaded question to address, I think to understand what lies behind such a question, which would be the trouble in the South, shall we say, or the noise of the background noise these days of world affairs coming from the South that is troublesome and problematic. It seems to me we still have to go back to your question, which is the question of chaos. And part of the answer would be to look at the dystrophies of these places and the history of a situation like the one ISIS and before that AQ, Al-Qaeda, or as I would suggest that we actually do, we link it with the actual question of anarchy itself and chaos. And where is this coming from historically? This question of chaos. It seems to me that whenever we look historically, you will have at any given period of time, at some more than others, some sort of perception that the world is drifting toward chaos, that there is anarchy, and there's key moments that we can point out to without going all the way back to Westphalia. 1815, sometime in the 1910s, sometimes in the 1930s, sometimes in the early 1970s. I am sure that if we were to decipher closely, not merely as historians but as analysts, what was the issue at the time, we would have the same signs of confusion that we have today. Which leads me to a first point about actually relativizing all of these questions. Yet, I would also argue to you that something is persistent about this question in the second decade of the early 21st century, that we have been looking increasingly today at signs pointing to some sort of persistent chaos. I would suggest to you that this has to do with mostly three things. First of all, unresolved narratives of the past 30 years. And by this I mean the question of one transition after the other. 1989, 2001, 2011. Post-Cold War, post-9/11, post-Arab Spring. There's unresolved narratives, questions that are still up in the air, and they have to do with the state. They have to do with this question of whether the nation state, as you were looking at, and this is already a beginning of an answer to why ISIS is emerging as such a question. So accumulated, unresolved transitions and no closure to these narratives, which raises a question, of course, of fragmentation. And I think this is what I would highlight, if anything, in my contribution. The sense of a transformation of the very grammar of international relations, at the heart of which we have actors manifesting themselves as such. The second one is I think, today, probably more than ever, now we can be historical in that sense, a sense of densification of international relations. This has to do, of course, with globalization, with the presence of a number of actors. Complexity itself, which has always been a factor in historical issues, is increasingly, I think, at the heart of what we're looking at. So we're looking at a matter of system stability, or instability for that matter, as we're looking at actors like this. But thirdly, I would also highlight the question, a matter which is a behavioral one, and that it has to do simply with choices, questions of leadership, or the lack thereof, over the past 30 years, and decisions in dealing with the first two questions, the complexity of this transformation. Now, in that, if you take that, then the question is how to look at the situation in the global south, and then specifically crises like Al-Qaeda or ISIS and whatnot. I would argue to you that it shouldn't be thought of in isolation, something that has to be addressed, something upon which some sort of solution has to be downloaded. I think in the field, as the NGOs and the international organizations would say, it's part and parcel of that chaos, or that order, if there is one. And what better example, by the way, of a globalized entity than ISIS today, for sure, and Al-Qaeda before it, lest we not forget how important Al-Qaeda was just 5 minutes ago before ISIS erupted. But this, therefore, is in the context of a couple of things that have been done over the past 20 years, which I think are giving us some indications why there is difficulty in addressing this question. I would point out to the militarization of international relations. I think that we have seen increasingly a drift towards that. One could argue that the Cold War itself for 50 years was a militarized order, for sure. But what I mean by that is the release, unrestrained and increasingly unregulated release of force, which has led to, one, the weakening of diplomacy, a diplomacy that we look upon as fatalistically moving towards failure before we move to solve this militarily. And then, of course, the unrestrained interventionism. And here I will be extremely explicit and hopefully provocative. Interventionism, I would submit to you, is highly problematic. And it's where we are today in 2015 as one of the questions that is not on the table. For all of its manifestations, it is not yet on the table of international relations. A rapid reminder: Somalia 92, Rwanda and Haiti 94, Timor 99, Yugoslavia 99, Afghanistan 2001, Iraq 2003, Ivory Coast 2004, Ivory Coast 2011, Libya 2011, Mali 2013, Central African Republic 2014, Iraq and Syria as we speak, and so on and so forth. An average of an intervention every 2-3 years over the past 25 years. Unprecedented. Before that, we did not have that. You had Afghanistan, the Soviet intervention in the 1980s, and a few decades earlier, the Congo, all in different contexts, Cold War and UN early days as such. What we have seen is the banalization and normalization of intervention, the result of which is what? First of all, most of the situations have worsened. Secondly, we have now to intervene to fix what the intervention did. Look at Iraq, look at Syria. And by the way, where's a good intervention, Syria, when you need one? So there is plenty of contradictions in the very practice of it. And either the tool itself is there to be used and we work with it and it gives us result, or if it is not working, then we have to ask the question. Now, the easy answer, which probably some of you have already on their minds, is, well, what are we supposed to do? Not intervene in the face of human rights violations and all of that? Two wrongs don't make a right. We have to think beyond that immediate emotional reaction and what R2P has to offer, and R2P is now part of the problem, shall we say, or the use of it is part of the problem, shall we say. Finally, we have seen something very interesting, a hybrid, horizontal interventionism over the past couple of years. Saudi Arabia going into Yemen, Kenya going into Somalia, Chad going into Nigeria a few weeks ago, Egypt going into Libya a few days ago. So this militarization plays out, is unrestrained, and it leads to what I would like to finish on. Having said all of that, one should not, Michael, absolutely not underestimate, and I completely agree with you, the novelty of what ISIS is. I think it's the biggest development since at least the death of bin Laden in terms of the history of transnational terrorism. It has made us forget about Al-Qaeda, which for 10 years, 15 years, was the biggest name in the news on a daily basis. Overnight, it did that. And I think there's a certain novelty to ISIS. We can come back to it in the discussion if there's interest. For the sake of time, I will say that it's a hybrid combination of a territorialization and the transnationalism aspect of it. And this combination of the two, the ability to project physically force and to control it while influencing people around the world who then go and act on their own, whether in Australia, in Paris, or whatnot, I think is making a big change to the very nature of what we're looking at. Rebellion, therefore, has to be theorized differently. And it's playing out already out of our control. We're playing catch-up to all of this, conceptually, much less in terms of the practice of it. Finally, in terms of some of these regions, I think that looking at the question of that type of actors, that is, these types of non-state actors, means understanding that they are a permanent feature of international relations. They're not necessarily something, unfortunately, that we can simply solve, check, and move on to the next issue. It may well be that the transformation, this discussion about Westphalia and post-Westphalia, is basically pointing to the permanence of the presence of non-state actors, and they've been here at least for 15 years, as the major threat to the US, to Europe, to the African states, to the Arab world, where there's 4 countries, as I speak, in war: Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, of course. Thank you. Clearly, you have, and where NSAs, non-state actors, at the heart of this. So to finish, I would say that I'll give an answer to the question you have asked earlier, which is about the state. I think that there's much merit to the state in spite of all of this. I do think that without having a statist perspective on international relations, I do think that destatization is the main problem in places like Africa, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa. The weakness of the fabric of the state, but at the same time, I would say that this needs self-capacitation and not necessarily external action to fix it in the midst of that, because that precisely gives rise to independent and uncontrolled actors. And I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you for your attention.
The brilliance of these speakers just blows me away. Thank you, Mahmoud. You've given us a lot to think about. Miguel Angel, you're a veteran of national diplomacy and of multilateral diplomacy. Yet your efforts on the Middle East front had to have been frustrating. How do you see the international system of governance evolving in dealing with issues like the Middle East? And more recently, your efforts to combat hunger. Is that more an effort of bilateral diplomacy or of multilateral diplomacy? What do you think? Thanks. And thanks for coming all the way from Madrid just for this evening.
Good evening. Well, let me first thank my dear old friend Michael to convince me to be part of this debate. I think it's an absolutely fascinating debate, not only on the venue. Geneva is always the capital of diplomacy, has been always an inspiring city to get new ideas, new proposals. The time is perfect. Well, 70 years since the creation of UN. I think Director Michael Moller will expand on that. Well, more or less 100 years after the First World War. So, my dear Michael, I will be autonomous, independent, free, and I will not follow your question, even I will be ready to ask you or to answer you about the Middle East, because I think what we have to start to discuss of this fascinating title, International Affairs Today, Towards Order or Anarchy, is what kind of world we want to live through. I mean, I have 63 years old already myself. I see some people of my age, but I see a lot of young people, students. It's your century. You should try to build up a new order. And with all my respect and friendship to Michael and the way he asked my predecessors in the Tribune, please don't make the mistake. Please don't repeat the lack of assessment of what has happened during the last centuries and the last moment when others try to build up a better world. We are in a new world. We are in 2015. We are not more in the 20th century. The world has changed. It's not black or white, it's gray, it's multicolor, whatever you want to make some color, but it's a total different world. And for that, with all my respect, to talk about the role of United States, to talk about the role of China, well, it's useful, yes. I don't, of course. We have to take into account some of their behavior. I agree with Jussi, it's unavailable to talk about the United States, but for sure it's not indispensable. No more, not at all. And if China gets the number one, okay, get the number one. But he will be ready to solve the many challenges and risks and crises and concern of the 21st century? For sure not. So if we look to the history of diplomacy, and I fully agree with my friend Mahmoud, that unfortunately what we are now witnessing is absolutely absence, well, absolutely, it's a bit cruel, a lack of real activity of diplomacy. Well, we should start to think about how we are going to organize ourselves, what are going to be the new rules, what are going to be the new architecture, what will be the new rapport de force of the 21st century. And we go to this analysis. Well, if we get extract some lesson from history, and I think all of us, we have read Kissinger new book and other proposals. Well, this dialectic between balance of power, well, it's a traditional, let's say, relation among countries, nation-state in the Westphalian model, and then in Vienna Congress, and then finally overcome by the League of Nations, and a great president, Woodrow Wilson, that, well, they said, let's go to create this collective security system that altogether will try to avoid war and to try to prevent a crisis collectively, not only by a single leader, or by two, or by three, or by four. Well, maybe it worked on the 20th century, this directoire. But what I can assure you today, it doesn't work. The proof is that we are stuck. The proof that we are all multilateral defender, and I will conclude on the defense of UN, because we need a strong UN, we need a reformed UN, we need a much more active UN, but a different UN of what we have today. So when I heard all the interventions that are brilliant and we have to take into account, of course, I think that is not the key issue. The first question we should ask ourselves, we go for a collective security system where not only nation state will be the ones who will be represented and trying to work out some response to the different challenges of the new agenda of international relations today, or we go back to the traditional balance of power of 2, 3, 4 countries, try to impose their view, because they don't are efficient to impose, because at least if they impose, we could have a quietness. But there is no any imposition of peace, for instance, the Middle East between Palestinian and Israeli. Well, let's welcome US and ability to impose peace in between Israelis and Palestinians. But it will not happen. That is not going to happen. I have a paper of, the comparison between the great economic corporation and states. Well, for instance, Royal Dutch Shell has the same GDP than Poland. Or Toyota Motors have more GDP than Egypt. Or Sinopec Corporation, all China company, has more GDP than Venezuela. So, are they actors or not? What is the place of the United States or Spain or some European? I could defend Europe, And I will convince you that you are more relevant than what the people say. We are not on decline at all. No, not at all. But Europe alone will not be able to put order in the new world. Why? Because we have a change. There is new actors. There is not only nation state that we should respect. They are not going to disappear, of course. But there will be corporations. There will be NGO. There will be media. There will be different interaction between these states and these new actors in the international arena. And secondly, because the agenda has changed. Of course there is war, and there are territorial disputes, and we have the old traditional diplomatic agenda, unfortunately. But the great challenge and risk today are not confrontation or military confrontation, but they are global terrorism, or they are migration, or they are climate change, or food security, or water scarcity. That's the new agenda of the 21st century. Or what happened with Ebola crisis? Some people has qualified in Africa is the terrorism of the poor. They don't have nothing, and they terrorize us with the epidemic that's Ebola. How was this crisis of Ebola? The F-16 or F-18 are going to bomb Sierra Leone, Gambia, or Freetown to protect our health and our security. What's happening in Italy now? Everybody is very concerned. Every year, every day, 1,000 people crossing the Mediterranean Sea. And what we are doing? Only to put more patrols, more military people, more security agents to try to avoid the crime. But have you seen any diplomatic initiative to go to the countries of origin or the countries of transit to start to work why these people are fleeing from sub-Saharan of Asia, other areas, to Europe? What happened in Ceuta and Melilla in Spain? We are every 2 weeks we put higher defense, higher. It doesn't stop them to come and to climb. So that are the issue. How we are going to solve of that? Well, we have to solve that with new ideas, my dear friends. Not with all ideas and all instruments. We are in 21st century. What happened with internet information? Are we going to put some rules there? Because when there was the telegraph, here in Geneva, they created in 1848 the Union Telegraph International. And there was the post, they created the Union Postale Universal. And it was regulated. And Michael Moller was the other day explaining to me the importance of Geneva, that all the normal science regulation that conduct the today's prosperity in the world are made here in the UN premises in Geneva. That is the agenda. It has to be done together. Of course, we have to reform, and that's I finally conclude this, because we have to discuss in the debate. We have to reform the UN. We have to reform the Security Council. I know it's difficult. It seems impossible. Even l'impossible n'est pas français, as they say. But we have to introduce new agenda. Why we don't introduce in Security Council debate all the Sustainable Development Goals? If President Obama has the courage and the vision to discuss Ebola in Security Council because it was a security matter, why you don't introduce in Security Council a new agenda? Why you don't start to introduce new procedures? Why you don't create center consensus among countries and main responsibilities? Well, we have to change also General Assembly to be much more democratic, with more capacity to represent and participate all countries in equal footing. It has to be a control, like all parliaments. The parliament controls the government. The UN General Assembly have to control the agencies, have to control even the Security Council in certain states. Put in question what you have not fulfilled. We have to establish new rules for any kind of activities that are completely new, like internet We cannot allow Mr. Snowden and some intelligence agency to come to the privacy of all of us. How we are going to live? I mean, there is no way. You have to start some rule to organize the world. And you have, of course, to establish new agencies that can cope with the new challenge and threat of international community. So my plea today is that what we have been discussing tonight here in Geneva, should be the beginning of serious discussion. It's a pity that we are in 2015, 2 decades and 5 years, 15 years already passed. Well, the 20th century, we wait 45 years, 2 world wars, and then we finally, politicians, head of state, the government decide, well, let's go to put some order. Let's go to the Barco Oak and go to San Francisco. 45 years, half a century, to create a new order in 20th century. Should we wait half a century ourselves to organize the new governance in the 21st century? Or should we have the Third World War? Because after war, everybody agreed that we have to behave better. Cannot now extract our lesson from the past and have enough maturity to say things can be done better? Why the governments, instead of being scholars or former ministers or former representatives here discussing in Geneva this important issue, that still now, in 2015, there has not been a formal or informal gathering of member states to discuss seriously the new challenge of the 21st century. That has to be done, and somebody has to take the lead. And I hope that Geneva and the Swiss diplomacy and the UN could, conduct us to this debate. So thank you very much, and I hope we can discuss later on the Middle East and other issues, because everything is interrelated.
Visionnaire, visionnaire, c'est tout ce que je peux dire. Michael, I would give the final word to you. The post-war order was built around the UN, as Miguel Angel has just eloquently stated. I was struck by a provocative column in Le Temps, and Frederic, thank you very much for bringing us. François Nordman had a column in Tuesday's Le Temps in which he commented on the temptation to create new instruments. Miguel Angel has just given us a spirited call for reform. Is it new instruments that we need, and what's the role of nation states in the formation of those new instruments? Or is the UN capable of reforming itself? Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Well, the way you have...
I think he means that.
Yeah, I do, actually, because it's been a very interesting discussion so far, and I hope it's going to get even more interesting. The way you have organized us shows that for once, putting people in alphabetical order actually works. And I have to thank Miguel Angel in particular for setting the stage for what I'm going to say. I found myself nodding to practically everything he said. And maybe some of what I'm going to say will answer some of it, and some of it will just reinforce some of the questions that he said, and we'll open up the debate here. I agree that many have the sentiment that we are moving towards greater disorder. That's pretty obvious when you read today's papers and practically every discussion that you have and that I have. I'll get back to. I just came back from Davos the other day, and that was a very clear red thread through the discussions. I'll come back to that in a second. The sentiment has been strengthened over the past year. The rise of ISIL, Daesh, or the Takfiri group, whatever terminology you may want to use, and the public brutality of this movement. The situation in Ukraine, terrorist attacks in Europe, both in Paris and now in my own country, in Copenhagen, developments in the Sahel and the Middle East, all of this have combined to reinforce this growing unease that we are headed towards more instability and imbalance in the world. I don't think, for example, that we would have had the exact same tone in the discussions if we'd had it 12 months ago, though some of the underlying trends were very much evident then. And we've already heard some of this from my fellow panelists. I certainly share the analysis that we are experiencing a very profound transformation in our global system that requires to rethink our policies and our institutions. Miguel just mentioned that very clearly and very eloquently. Whether this amounts to anarchy or the coming anarchy is another question. Let me first highlight a number of trends that I think are very critical in trying to analyze that and seeing where we're coming. And this will also, I will also touch a little bit on what it means for the UN. First of all is the issue of complexity. The challenges we face are increasingly interlinked, and our understanding of the interlinkages is much more sophisticated today than it has ever been. One example was mentioned is climate change. Climate change is an existential threat that has significant impact on development, but also has security implications and a whole series of other social and cultural implications. And we are beginning to have a much better analytical understanding of these linkages, but our institutional structures are completely behind the curve. Global processes and operational tools are far from adequate to address this level of interconnectivity effectively. We have systems that were built 70 years ago. The problems that we have today and those that we're going to have tomorrow, the gap between that and our systems is growing, and we need to address that quite soon if we're not going to have even more problems. Second trend is something that I'm thinking about more and more these days, and we have mentioned it. There has been several mention to the issue of rules-based management of our planet. I'm seeing more and more a walking away from the rules. We see there being rules that we have worked very hard on for many decades, and in some cases spent a lot of blood and tears in agreeing on, are being thrown out the window. And you more and more have the feeling that it's, the world, and certainly the management of it, is a free-for-all, where everybody just does what they think they want to without any consequences. Global governance is about an agreed set of principles, or at least was, and frameworks that we should all respect because we have been involved in setting them up, and because running a world, just like running a family, has to be based on some agreed set of rules if we're not going to go in all sorts of directions and have chaos. They are increasingly flouted, and they're increasingly flouted without consequences. Just think of the preeminent arbiter of peace and security, the Security Council, which most people today think are sitting on their hands and not doing their job as they should. This comes with a sense, and it's linked, first of all, a pervasive sense that you see across the world of a deep sense of injustice. I think that the way that we have been managing things and the way that we have been addressing some of the problems, and I don't have enough time to go into details, but is engendering a sense of injustice across societies that is in itself and engendering a very deep sense of mistrust. We're watching, this is linked to this is a progression if you want, it's linked to the blatant flouting of rules, it's linked to unfulfilled expectations, and that these rules can be discarded with impunity, and that there are some rules for some and others rules for others. That this is an asymmetric application of law, international law, and even local law, and that the rich can do what they want, and the rest of us can just, do without or accept what is being given us. Sorry, I have to reorganize my papers here. So this brings a pervasive sense in many societies that the authorities, in quote, those who are supposed to manage our daily affairs and provide us with our necessities on a daily basis, no longer deliver, don't have integrity, and are simply not up to the task. As I said, I was the other day, last week or the week before at Davos, and one of the interesting things there was this, that one of the red lines or the red threads through the discussions in practically every meeting I was in was this issue of trust deficit and what we're going to do about it in order to get it back. 4 is the technological change. Some of us have mentioned that. It's changing fundamentally the interaction between us, between people. It's going from being an aid in delivering services to being something that defines and determines the services that can be delivered. This brings, on one hand, great potential for empowerment, but it's also, on the other hand, carries great risks of entrenching or even exacerbating inequalities. We have, in today's world, there is now 7 billion cell phones on our planet. It's, logically it's one for every person. It isn't quite. But the fact is, it's a rather telling statistic that tells us that there are an enormous amount of people with a voice who all want to use it and do. But it's a cacophony rather than an organized set of conversations based on knowledge and on facts that would bring us greater coherence in the way that we run our affairs. 5 is the democratic changes. People are moving to cities. By 2050, somewhere between 70 and 75% of all of us on this planet are going to be living in cities. That is bringing and will bring enormous changes, both in terms of our decision making and our outlook and our focus on the kinds of services and the kinds of development models and just practically everything that we do to make life livable is going to be changing, and the level of decision making is going to be changing. And that we can come back to a discussion about that because it goes to the heart of the importance of the state as we know it today. I see a lot of the critical decision making is going to move down to the city and the municipal level, at least where the daily concerns and needs of citizens are concerned. So ours is a world of great asymmetries right now, fragmentation in political influence and economic weight at national and individual level, and this has and will have, for a while at least, powerful destabilizing effect and lead us to some disorder before we get our act together. The fact is that it doesn't necessarily need to be so. It will to a large extent depend on whether we are smart and serious enough on how to react. At the global level, I think that we are already experiencing, but will experience even more so, a recalibration of the role of the state, with a greater number of decisions, as I said, taken at other levels and by other actors. Miguel mentioned the need to bring in a whole slew of different actors, and I quite agree with that. Key characteristics will be more direct engagement by citizens and a trend towards a multi-stakeholder approach with more inclusive decision-making and with a much greater demand for active participation, justice and equality in the relations between individuals and institutions. And this is a shift that challenges, obviously, the established centers of power, and that will gives a sense of disorder, or at least of great uncertainty as to where we are headed and how. And that's where we are now. I haven't even gone into the issue of leadership, which is obviously another element in this long list of causalities, if you want. But there's a cause and effect, I think, between the leadership crisis that we're also experiencing across the world and the fact of these very transformative changes, both at the technological and the decision-making levels. So what does this mean for the United Nations was one of your questions. And what are the prospects for reform? I think that the current constellations of challenges and trends represents an opportunity and a very crying need for reform. I think that, in fact, and I tend to believe that reform is actually not a word that's strong enough. We need a very severe and deep restructuring of the international system as we know it today. Whether our political leaders have the courage, guts, wherewithal to actually undertake such a change is a very different matter. Today they don't. I don't think that the political will exist there, but I do believe that reality, as it always does, will impose itself on all of us, and including on them. So what we need to deal with now in the short and medium term is how we, while we wait for the political realities and the political landscape to adjust, how do we get to where we need to be in different ways. In other words, we have a problem, we need to find solutions. We're not going to get it by the most expedient and most logical way, so we need to find a way around the problem to get to where we need to be. The only way I see to do so is to make better use of the tools that we have already. We have in the international system, not just through the system of the United Nations, an extraordinary amount of expertise, knowledge that just needs to be put to better use, recalibrated, and targeted better. So it means that we need to figure out ways of working much better together. And it's a process that is in course, and for my taste not fast enough, and I think it's not fast enough in terms of the realities that are imposing themselves on us. But still, this is where we need to go. There's a few points where the UN, there's plenty of them, but let me just mention a few things. First of all, I already alluded to, and I wasn't alone in that, we have to include other stakeholders. It's simply not sustainable in the long term not to involve civil society in its many manifestations, and particularly the private sector, much more directly in decision making. They have to be around the decision making table. It is happening already, but as I said, not fast enough, and in not an organized way enough. It's happening, and in some cases very successfully. If you look at very specific issues like health, girls' education, or other issues where there has been the creation of multi-stakeholders, arrangements that have actually been very successful in delivering where other systems have not been able to. But it's still haphazard. It's not something that is. It's something that is still very much done around specific issues. It's not brought to scale, and it's something that we need to take some lessons for and build it into our structures and our governance structures. So we need a new generation of multi-stakeholder partnerships that will go beyond just the superficial consultation of other partners in order to include them more directly in what we do. We need to recalibrate, I mentioned that earlier in a different way, but we need to recalibrate our institutions. We will need to address challenges in what is much more a matrix format. It's a way of doing business that brings together the peace and security aspects of our problems together with social and economic issues. And this has to happen not just in the way that we analyze problems, but in our operational responses much better than we have been able to until now. Of course, it has been mentioned before, we need to start taking some very critical look at the key institutions, to start with the Security Council, which is simply not working anymore. It's not representative, it's not effective, and it doesn't reflect our intellectual understanding of the complexity of the problems. So when the Security Council takes decisions today, it doesn't really look at the economic and social underpinnings of the problems they're trying to solve, but look at very much in a narrow peace and security, and that simply doesn't work any longer. I think that has been proven several times. We also have to move away, and that's a problem that is pervasive, not necessarily only in the UN system, but certainly in the member states that make up of it, and that is the issue of short-termism. Our political systems, and particularly our electoral systems, are 3 to 5 years maximum. The problems we have to deal with and the way we need to deal with them need a much longer time scale. Let me give you an example. A failed state, let's take Haiti at the time where I served some years ago, where the system tried very hard and is still trying very hard to help it get back on its knees, off its knees and back on its feet. The twin problem of competing interests and agendas between the different actors, and the fact that the attitude, the financing and the planning and the horizon with which most of these actors were working are only 3 years or maximum 5, simply is inimical to any kind of long-term program that will actually help a country like that get back on its feet. So I agree with you that Ambassador Norman's article a couple of days ago, where he says that there is not currently sufficient political will for the very profound overhaul that is necessary, is the reality of today. It will probably mean, in the short term and maybe medium term, more fragmentation, somewhat more disorder, but we'll get there. We have to, and we have the tools to do it. We have the money to do it. We have the expertise, and if there's and I was just going to say, if there's one thing that always keeps me on the optimist side, is that as a race we have this extraordinarily strong survival gene. So when the knife is really at our neck, we figure it out somehow. But I want to end on a slightly more positive note, because I want to remind you all of some facts that are both positive, but at the same time also highlight what we have to lose if we don't get our act together. If you look at today at the key economic and social parameters, the human race has never had it so good as we have today. We are healthier, we live longer, we're better educated, we're more connected than ever before in human history. Since 1990, the world has reduced extreme poverty by half. That's only 25 years ago. In the same period, 2.3 billion people gained access to safe drinking water, and over a quarter of the world's population gained access to improved sanitation, while child mortality dropped by 50%. The number of children out of school has been halved since the year 2000. In 1990, 1 million people owned a cell phone. As I said, today there are 7 billion of them on the world. Wow. So, we have done pretty good as people and as a race. And my point is that unless we get our governance issues right, we stand to lose a hell of a lot more than some of our ancestors did just a few decades ago. So let me stop here.
Well, that was a nice note to end on. Thank you, Michael. We went a little bit over in time, but I want to offer the audience time to express your views or to ask a question to one of the panelists or to all of us together. The floor is yours now. I think there are some mics that... There's a young woman here in the fourth row from the top. Oops. Oh.
Thank you. My name is Ibrahim. I'm the former ambassador of Yemen in Geneva. I want to start by Mahmoud with excellent presentation. When he highlighted few points, I want just stop on what he spoke about intervention. Now, Security Council today is debating the issue, Libya issue, and some kind of, it could be some intervention here or there. So they are talking about lifting the embargo of arms and so on. Now, intervention policy will remain since the balance of power of world politics is remaining. So unless the UN charter will not be implemented, that will be diffused to the international order. Now, I think the issues of poverty, unemployment rate, increasing of unemployment rate, economy, poverty, starvation, this is especially in education. Last night we had President Obama speaking about it, so especially of education. Now, this is an issue. Don't you think that this issue, if it is going to be addressed, that is might change the whole political system? Now, this is one point. Second point.
Yeah, Mr. Ambassador, do we have a question here?
Yes. Now, issues of poverty, economy, education, and starvation, if it is going to be dealt, how it can change the whole anarchy system. Now, this is one question. The second question is...
Miguel Angel, you might want to handle that if we're talking about hunger.
Yeah. And now, about is the Syrian policy mistake. Now, I think that was very much compromised from United States. It gives too much compromise and too much space to Iran and Russia.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, can I ask, or is there a question here?
Yes.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah. Now, I have a straight question of this. Do you think there is a deal between the Americans and the Iranians in regard to recognize only Iran, the only power in the Gulf? Thank you very much.
I think I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions. And there's a young woman who's had her hand up from the very beginning, about the 4th row down from the top. Would you raise your hand so that people can see? Yeah. There you go.
Thank you. Sophie Gatscha. I work for UNICEF here in Geneva. My question refers to an actor that has been mentioned twice now, which is the private sector. I originally wanted to ask something more positive, asking what positive contribution the private sector could bring to the international system as it is now. But as the positive side has already been mentioned, I'd kind of like to be a bit more critical now, and was wondering if the private sector, beyond some development cooperation and support in emergencies, as Michael Moller mentioned, could have a positive role, or if the original goal of any private company, which is to make profit, couldn't have a lot of risks more than positive effects.
Okay. Michael, do you want to take on that one? And I'll take one other question. Sir.
Thank you. One of the things that I think we have addressed earlier and we forgot about is the role of ISIS or ISIL in the world today. In fact, I think the world number 1 power and world number 2 powers are no longer the United States and China, but it's ISIL, because they are in fact controlling a lot of what's going on. Now, how do they get the recruits? The recruiting is really through things like CNN and the media, because this becomes a very serious aspect of getting people in. I know we have the right of free speech, but is free speech really totally free? And should we be addressing something about restricting the amount of coverage these guys get?
That's a controversial proposal. I'm not sure who would want to handle that. So we've got 3 questions. Go ahead, Mahmoud, you want to take that on? And we'll take the 3rd question first, and then we'll move Michael to the 2nd, and Miguel Angel, if you can handle the 1st.
Thank you. I think there's 2 questions here very quickly. The one on intervention is, the point I was trying to make is that the question of intervention is not merely a political one. I think I see this as an issue, as a systemic issue. It's about the nature of the relationship today between states, between non-state armed groups. It's about reflecting beyond trying to have this as a quick fix. And the only logic out of that is that the pattern that we have seen, that I try to remind ourselves of, has not necessarily proven to be actually successful factually. Because that's a demonstrable fact, what I'm inviting is a reflection about what to look as sets of responses that we can have to these crises that would go beyond that. And one of them is maybe to go back to something that used to be pretty efficient, or at least pretty respected, which is the question of diplomacy. Diplomacy of old, which was quite able to solve pretty deep crises. Think about the 60s and nuclear war crisis and so on. And I think that has been gradually set aside. That doesn't question what I said earlier in terms of the gravity of the issues that we're looking at, and this is the ISIL question. On Iran, the US, no, I don't think there's a deal. I think that we just simply leave it at that. I think it takes us into conspiracy theory. I don't think that two sets of interests that might combine at a given moment on a particular situation, Iraq, for instance, these days necessarily mean that they are aligned. It's just part of the complexity that we were trying to highlight. On ISIS, I think that you're absolutely right. If one is to define what is power today, one would not necessarily define it in terms of might, the traditional understanding that we have of that, but simply power can be defined as the ability to define a goal, strategic one, give yourselves the means to pursue that, and maintain that success. And if one looks at it in that line of understanding, then clearly both Al-Qaeda before ISIS, Al-Qaeda gave birth to ISIS, let's not forget that, part of several other issues, and ISIS today. And I think the ability to project this power, to replenish it on a regular basis, to expand it, to hold territory, to be transnational about it, and to have people move towards it is extremely, extremely sophisticated in terms of what we're looking at. Where I disagree with you is that I think that we're already seeing limitations to the visibility of what it's trying to say. One doesn't see the videos. I mean, they're there in cyberspace, but they're not covered in Al Jazeera and CNN and France 24 and so on. I would disagree with that. I think that's actually part of the problem. I think one should be able to address the questions without necessarily shrinking privacy rights. It's a separate issue, but I do believe that the ability to project that, regardless of the mainstream media, is actually very, very much part of the power that they have, and I agree with you on that.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Michael?
Yeah, thank you. I personally don't think that the involvement of business is even a question any longer. It's a must. Now, of course, business is out to make money. But one of the interesting trends that we see, and certainly I see, is that more and more, and particularly the multinationals, are internalizing, if you want, the realization that actually being a good corporate citizen or being a good citizen in the areas where they do business is actually more profitable than not. I referred to the fact that I was in Davos the other day, and it was very clear, very striking actually. In practically every discussion I was in, practically the only ones that came up with doable, actionable solutions to some of the problems we were discussing were the leaders of big corporations. It wasn't the politicians, it wasn't the diplomats, and it wasn't my colleagues. And when you look particularly at one of the defining issues of our time right now, which is climate change, the seriousness and the depth and the breadth of activities and actions that are being taken by business across the world right now on this issue of climate change, a whole series of issues of climate change, right now dwarf what governments are doing, no question. So they have to be at the table, and they obviously it has to be done in a way that is consensual. It's not just them dictating what the rest of us are going to do. It's about a conversation where both the expertise and the concerns and the solutions that they bring can be brought together in a greater unity. And let me leave you on this issue with a thought. We're about to enter into the election season for a new Secretary General. I see absolutely no reason why the next Secretary General cannot be the head of a major corporation. These people have much more both managerial and international experience than most of the candidates that you will otherwise see coming up
to try to catch the prize. For good and bad.
Miguel, you want to take up the hunger challenge?
Yeah, well, I think, Ambassador, you have absolutely put the finger in the root causes of this instability. I mean, I've been a candidate for Food and Agriculture Agency, and I was quite involved in all food security issues. And Massachusetts Technological Institute made a study crossing data and figures between food scarcity, hunger, and political crisis and social crisis, coming to the conclusion that even not only, but one of the causes of the so-called Arab Spring, the despair of people, the need of changing the reality, was also due to the economic and social condition of the people. So education, food security, social cohesion are the real challenge for today's new agenda. And I think that we should try to really address, and it can be addressed. It's not utopia. I mean, it's really amazing that even today, every year, it's true, it's a bit better. And in September, when we will make a final evaluation of MDGs, they will say, well, you know, the poverty has decreased, but still there is practically 900 million people that are under nutrition, that are hunger. So how in the 21st century we can, as politicians, as human beings, accept every morning that there are such a situation where women, children are dying by hunger, something unacceptable. And we know the condition, we know the meteorological climate, we know we have the technology, we know how to, but still there is a lack of political will to overcome this challenge. So I think it should be number one priority in the new UN reform. Thank you.
Thank you. We're over 8 o'clock now, and I hesitate to go for another round of questions. Unless, Jacqueline, you would allow another 10 minutes to... All right, another round. Cornelio, please. Question from the former president of the ICRC.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Cornelio Sommaruga. I was impressed by the words of Michael Moller when he said that the United Nations should be restructured and that there was the need of introduce new stakeholders as civil society and private sector. I would like to add one element here of other type of stakeholders. I was very impressed when reading the Cardoso report on civil society, where he gives a great importance to parliamentarians, to be associated into all kind of political life. I have here the sentence in French where he says il faut s'attaquer à une des principales incohérences du monde politique contemporain, à savoir que la substance de la politique est de plus en plus internationale, tandis que le processus de la politique reste essentiellement national. And my question is, should not parliamentarians be inserted more in this restructuring?
Go ahead, Michael.
I couldn't agree more, and we're working on, I certainly am working on that. And we happen to have in Geneva the Interparliamentary Union, and I'm spending a lot of time not only talking to them, but figuring out ways of using parliaments through them as a multiplier of the messages that we're trying to bring out there. So it's a two-way street. I've been telling them for the past 20 years we have been trying hard to inject the parliamentary dimension into the work of the UN. The time now is to inject the UN into the work of the parliaments. And it's beginning to work. I think we are having more and more the realization among my colleagues and the different agencies, heads of agencies, that they have there quite an extraordinary tool for getting the message out and for making sure that whatever actions they're going to take in different countries are going to take better root with the help of the local parliamentarians. I think there was an interesting, you quoted the Cardozo report, which is quite a few years back. The other day I was reading a speech by one of my bosses, the Deputy Secretary General, or an interview where he said that one of the tricks we have to find is to convince national governments and national parliaments that a lot of the solutions, their solutions at national level, are to be found in the international arena. So it's a two-way thing. So I agree with you. So
Thanks, Michael. We'll take one other question. Wait, I'm going to go to the female side. Wait. Miguel Angel, you were pointing.
Yes, a guy is raising hand. From the beginning.
All right. Go ahead, go.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm a student of the Graduate Institute. For me, it's very surprising, and I don't know why. Nothing has been said about the hot ongoing conflict in the eastern Ukraine. And I have two questions. How do you see the future of this conflict? And is it likely to provoke a war in the center of Europe? And the second question, why was it ignored? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd say I challenge you on that because I did mention it in my opening remarks. But it's an excellent question. Does anyone, Jussi, do you want to pick that up? No, let's go with this one.
Okay. So, why this was ignored? I actually had anticipated we were going to have a great discussion about the new Cold War. Sadly, as a Cold War historian, I would have loved that. Sadly, we didn't get there, so I'm very, very disappointed about that myself. So I don't know. I was expecting we'd get to the question of Ukraine at some point. So now we did, and that's good.
So thank you.
So thank you. Yes, I'm glad glad you went there.
Well, thanks to Miguel Angel.
It's all Cold War.
Right. So I'm a historian. I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. Okay. Most of you don't either, but you won't admit it. However, I would make an educated guess or semi-educated guess to say that certainly, I mean, if you think about this as some kind of a new Cold War, then forget about it, as they say in New York. This is not a new Cold War. There's nothing in the current Russian-American relationship that really resembles the one that existed between 1945 and 1990. There's so many elements missing from this, given the global reach of those two, the Cold War, number one, and all the ideological elements that went into the Cold War, etc., etc. So that part, I would say no. You didn't ask about that. You asked what's going to happen in the Ukraine. Is there going to be a war in Central Europe?
There is a war.
I'm sorry?
Wanted to hear your opinion about how the conflict is going to evolve. I mean,
yeah.
Because there is a war already.
There is a war, of course. There was a ceasefire that lasted 5 minutes, and the war goes on at a lower intensity level than it did before. I think that's for sure. My guess is for the near and probably the medium future, we're going to see more of the same. Nothing really has changed on the ground. The fact that Merkel and François Hollande and so on went to Belarus did not solve the crisis. the fundamental issues that are at stake. However, my guess is that none of the, like stakeholder is a great term, historians don't really use it, but I love it. So many of the stakeholders, Russia, European Union, etc., certainly I would guess do not have an ongoing interest in seeing the conflict prolonged. The ones that do have, of course, are the ones, the separatists that want to break away from the Ukraine. Now, what has happened, I think, over the last year or two, that certainly the Russian leadership has sort of cornered itself into a position. It's very difficult, without a serious loss of face, to totally abandon the East Ukrainian separatist movement. And that's, I think, why it's very likely that there will not be an immediate solution anytime, I would say, in the next 6 months to the crisis. However, I would guess that by the time, if we meet here this time next year, it is likely that some form of solution has been arrived at, in which you will see a much more autonomous region in the eastern part of Ukraine. Not an independent one, not part of Russia, but a more autonomous one. So you're going to see, if I may put it, a Crimea light from the Russian perspective.
Thank you, Jussi. I was going to give Frederic a final word to sum up from the civil society, since no one directed a question at you.
Well, no, maybe I'll just jump on the question of Russia.
Sure.
I think it's interesting, and actually I can talk about civil society a bit as well. I'm very, how to say, struck and surprised, and I think it's very interesting what Mr. Moller says about the UN, how to restructure UN and the participation of civil society and the private sector. And of course, I think for a European that speaks quite directly, and we understand what you mean. But I'm not sure that this kind of ideas would be very well understood maybe in countries like Russia or China. I think what we've seen and what we assist and what we're seeing now with the attitude of Russia. And I could make many comparisons between Russia and China, even though there are many differences as well. There is a strong sense of statehood, and there is a strong sense of this sphere of influence and kind of old style of international relationship as we used to have in Europe, at least. So I see how UN should be restructured and how it needs to be renovated, for sure. But then we have now again maybe this what I would call the clash, a serious clash of if we want to think about the new world order. I think then that this is the good question of how Russia would see that and China would see these ideas. I don't know if you already talked with some Chinese colleagues and what they think about these ideas.
Thank you, Frederic. I think that is going to be the final word. I'm sorry, some of you we didn't get to for questions. Perhaps the panelists will be here for a few minutes if you want to come up and ask your question. I want to thank you all for your participation, and certainly I want to thank the 5 panelists for your inspirational words, provocative, and I think we've all been given a great deal to think about. Frederic, I don't know if you're going to do your Saturday column discussing this evening, but hopefully we'll continue to see these themes in the days and weeks to come. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and thanks to the Graduate Institute and GCSP for hosting this event. I thank you all for coming. And especially Miguel Angel, who flew all the way up from Madrid for this discussion.